can't sell his head? What sort of a bamboozling story is this you are telling me? Getting into a towering rage, do you pretend to say, landlord, that this harpooneer is actually engaged this blessed Saturday night, or rather Sunday morning, in peddling his head around this town? That's precisely it, said the landlord, and I told him he couldn't sell it here. The market's overstocked. With what? Shouted I. With heads, to be sure. Ain't there too many heads in the world? I tell you what it is, landlord, said I quite calmly. You'd better stop spinning that yarn to me. I'm not green. Maybe not, taking out a stick and whittling a toothpick, but I rather guess you'd be done brown if your Herr Harpooneer hears you a slanderin' his head. I'll break it to him. I'll break it for him, said I, now flying into a passion again at this unaccountable farrago of the landlord's. It's broke already, said he. Broke, said I. Broke? Do you mean Sartan? And that's the very reason he can't sell it, I guess. Landlord, said I, going up to him as cool as Mount Helka in a snowstorm. Landlord, stop whittling. You and I must understand one another, and that too without delay. I come to your house and want a bed. You tell me you can only give me half of one, that the other half belongs to a certain harpooneer, and about this harpooneer, whom I have not seen yet, you persist in telling me the most mystifying and exasperating stories, tending to beget in me an uncomfortable feeling toward the man whom you desire for my bedfellow. A sort of connection, landlord, which is an intimate and confidential one in the highest degree. I now demand of you speak out and tell me who and what this harpooner is, and whether I shall be in all respects safe to spend the night with him. And in the first place, you will be so good as to unsay that story about selling his head, which, if true, I take to be good evidence that this harpooneer is stark mad, and I've no idea of sleeping with a madman. And you, sir, you, I mean landlord, you, sir, by trying to induce me to do so knowingly, would thereby render yourself liable to a criminal prosecution. Wall, said the landlord, fetching a long breath, that's a purty long sarmon for a chap that rips a little now and then. But be easy, be easy. This here harpooneer I have been telling you of has just arrived from the South Seas, where he bought up lots of balmed New Zealand eds, great curios, you know, and he's sold them all but one, and that one he's trying to sell tonight, 'cause tomorrow's Sunday, and it would not be to be sellin' human heads about the streets when folks is goin' to churches. He wanted to last Sunday, but I stopped him just as he was goin' out the door with 4 heads strung on a string, all for the airth, like a string of onions. This account cleared up the otherwise unaccountable mystery, and showed that the landlord after all had had no idea of fooling me, but at the same time what could I think of the harpooneer who stayed out of a Saturday night clean into the holy Sabbath engaged in such a cannibal business as selling the heads of dead idolaters? Depend upon it, landlord, that harpooneer is a dangerous man. He pays regular, was the rejoinder, but come, it's getting dreadful late. You had better be turning flukes. It's a nice bed. Sal and me slept in that air bed the night we were spliced. There's plenty room for two to kick about in that bed. It's an almighty big bed that. Why, afore we give it up, Sal used to put our Sam and little Johnny in the foot of it. But I got a dreamin' and sprawlin' about one night, and somehow Sam got pitched on the floor and came near breakin' his arm. Arter that, Sal said it wouldn't do. Come along, I'll give you a glim in a jiffy. And so saying, he lighted a candle and held it towards me, offering to lead the way. But I stood irresolute when looking at a clock in the corner. He exclaimed, I vomit Sunday. You won't see that harpooneer tonight. He's come to anchor somewhere. Come along then. Do come. Won't you come? Won't ye come? I considered the matter a moment, and then upstairs we went, and I was ushered into a small room, cold as a clam, and furnished sure enough with a prodigious bed, almost as big enough indeed for any four harpooneers to sleep abreast. There, said the landlord, placing the candle on a crazy old sea chest that did double duty as a washstand and center table. There, make yourself comfortable now, and good night to ye. I turned around from eyeing the bed, but he had disappeared. Folding back the counterpane, I stood over the bed. Though none of the most elegant, it yet stood the scrutiny tolerably well. I then glanced around the room. Beside the bed stand and center table, could see no other furniture belonging to the place but a rude shelf, the four walls, and a papered fireboard representing a man striking a whale. Of things not properly belonging to the room, there was a hammock lashed up and thrown about the floor in one corner, and a large seaman's bag, containing the harpooneer's wardrobe no doubt, in lieu of a land trunk. Likewise there was a parcel of outlandish bonefish hooks on the shelf over the fireplace, and a tall harpoon standing in the head of the bed. But what is this on the chest? I took it up and held it close to the light and felt it and smelt it, and tried every way possible to arrive at some satisfactory conclusion concerning it. I can compare it to nothing but a large door mat, ornamented at the edges with a little tinkling tag, something like the stained porcupine quills round a Indian moccasin. There was a hole or slit in the middle of that mat, the same as in South American ponchos, but could it be possible that any sober harpooner would get into a doormat and parade the streets of any Christian town in that sort of guise? I put it on to try it, and it weighed me down like a hamper, being uncomfortably shaggy and thick. I thought it a little damp, and though this mysterious harpooner had been wearing it on a rainy day, I went up in it to be a bit glass struck against the wall, and I never saw such a sight in my life. I tore myself out of it in such a hurry, and gave myself a kink in the neck. I sat down on the side of the bed, and commenced thinking about this head-peddling harpooner and his door-mat. After thinking some time on the bedside, I got up and took off my monkey jacket, and then stood in the middle of the room thinking. And then I took off my coat, and thought a little more in my shirt sleeves, but beginning to feel very cold now, half undressed as I was, and remembering what the landlord said about the harpooner not coming home at all that night, it being so very late, I made no more ado, but jumped out of my pantaloons and boots, and then blowing out the light tumbled into bed, and commended myself to the care of heaven. Whether that mattress was stuffed with corn cobs or broken crockery, there is no telling, but I rolled about a good deal, and could not sleep for a long time. At last I slid off into a light doze, and had pretty nearly made a good offing towards the land of Nod, when I heard a heavy footfall in the passage, and I saw a glimmer of light come into the room from under the door. Lord save me, thinks I, that must be the harpooner, the infernal head peddler. But I lay perfectly still, and resolved not to say a word till spoken to. Holding a light in one hand, and that identical New Zealand head in the other, the stranger entered the room, and without looking toward the bed, placed his candle a good way off from me on the floor in one corner, and then began working away at the knotted cords of the large bag I before spoke of as being in the room. I was all eagerness to see his face, but he kept it averted for some time while employed in unlacing the bag's mouth. This accomplished, however, he had turned around, when, good heavens, what a sight! Such a face! It was of a dark purplish yellow color, here and there struck over with large blackish looking squares. Yes, it's just as I thought. He's a terrible bedfellow. He's been in a fight, got dreadfully cut, and there he is, just from the surgeon. But at the moment he chanced to turn his face so toward the light, that I plainly saw that they could not be sticking plasters at all, but black squares on his cheeks. They were the stains of some sort of or other. At first I knew not what to make of this, but soon an inkling of the truth occurred to me. I remembered a story of a white man, a whale man too, who falling among the cannibals had been tattooed by them. I concluded that this harpooner in the course of his distant voyages must have met with similar adventure. And what is it, thought I, after all? It's only his outside. A man can be honest in any sort of skin. But then, what to make of his unearthly complexion, that part of it, I mean, lying round about and completely independent of the squares of tattooing? To be sure, it might be nothing but a good coat of tropical tanning, but I never heard of a hot sun's tanning a white man into a purplish yellow one. However, I had never been in the South Seas, and perhaps the sun there produced these extraordinary effects upon the skin. Now, while all these ideas were passing through me like lightning, this harpooner never noticed me at all, but after some difficulty, having opened his bag, he commenced fumbling in it, and presently pulled out a sort of tomahawk, a sealskin wallet with hair on it. Placing these on the old chest in the middle of the room, he took the New Zealand head, a ghastly thing enough, and crammed it down into the bag. He now took off his hat, a new beaver hat, when I came nigh singing out with fresh surprise. There was no hair on his head, none to speak of at least, nothing but a small scalp knot twisted up on his forehead. His bald purplish head now looked for all the world like a mildewed skull. He had not the stranger stood between me and the door, I would have bolted out of it quicker than ever I bolted a dinner. Even as it was, I thought something of slipping out of the window, but it was the second floor back. I am no coward, but what to make of this head-peddling purple rascal altogether past my comprehension. Ignorance is the parent of fear, and being completely nonplussed and confounded about the stranger, I confessed I was now as much afraid of him as it was the devil himself who had thus broken into my room at the dead of night. In fact, I was so afraid of him that I was not game enough to then address him and demand a satisfactory answer concerning what seemed inexplicable in him. Meanwhile he continued the business of undressing, at last showed his chest and arms. As I live, these covered parts of him were checkered with the same squares as his face. His back, too, was all over the same dark squares. He seemed to have been in a 30 years' war and just escaped from it with a sticking plaster shirt. Still more, his legs were marked as if a parcel of dark green frogs were running up the trunks of young palms. It was now quite plain that he must have been some abominable savage or other shipped aboard of a whaleman in the South Seas, and so landed in this Christian country. I squawked to think of it. A peddler of heads, too, perhaps the heads of his own brothers. He might take a fancy to mine. Heavens, look at that tomahawk! But there was no time for shuddering, for now the savage went about something that completely fascinated my attention, and convinced me that he must indeed be a heathen. Going to his heavy grego, or rapall, or dreadnought, which he had previously hung on a chair, he fumbled in the pockets and produced at length a curious little deformed image of a hunch on its back, and exactly the color of a 3 days old Congo baby. Remembering the embalmed head, at first I almost thought that this blackish manikin was a real baby preserved in some similar manner, but seeing that it was not at all limber, but it glistened a good deal like polished ebony, I concluded that it must be nothing but a wooden idol, which indeed it proved to be. For now the savage goes up to the empty fireplace, and removing the papered fireboard, sets up this little hunchbacked image, like a tenpin between errands and irons. The chimney jabs and all the bricks inside were very sooty, so that I thought this fireplace made a very appropriate little shrine or chapel for his Congo idol. I now screwed my eyes hard toward the half-hidden image, feeling but ill at ease meantime to see what the next to follow. First he takes about a double handful of shavings out of his grego pocket and placed them carefully before the idol, then laying a bit of ship biscuit on top and applying the flame from the lamp, he kindled the shavings into a sacrificial blaze. Presently, after many hasty snatches into the fire, and still hastier withdrawals of his fingers, whereby he seemed to be scorching them badly, he at last succeeded in drawing out the biscuit. Then, blowing off the heat and ashes a little, made a polite offering of it to the little negro. But the little devil did not seem to fancy such dry sort of fare at all. He never moved his lips. All these strange antics were accompanied by still stranger guttural noises from the devotee, who seemed to be praying in a sing-song, or else singing some pagan psalmody or other, during which his face twitched about in the most unnatural manner. At last extinguished by the fire, he took the idol up very unceremoniously, and bagged it again in his grego pocket as carelessly as if he were a sportsman bagging a dead woodcock. All these queer proceedings increased my uncomfortableness, and seeing him now exhibiting strong symptoms of concluding his business operations and jumping into bed with me, I thought it was high time, now or never, before the light was put out, to break the spell in which I had so long been bound. But the interval I spent in deliberating what to say was a fatal one. Taking up his tomahawk from the table, he examined the head of it for an instant, and then holding it to the light with his mouth at the handle, he puffed out great clouds of tobacco smoke. The next moment the light was extinguished, and this wild cannibal, tomahawk between his teeth, sprang into bed with me. I sang out. I could not help it, and giving a sudden grunt of astonishment, he began feeling me. Stammering out something, I knew not what, I rolled away from him against the wall, and then conjuring him, whoever or whatever he might be, to keep quiet and let me get up and light the lamp again. But his guttural responses satisfied me at once that he but ill comprehended my meaning. "Hui debble you," he said at last. "You no speakee damn me, I killee." And so said the lighted tomahawk between flourished about me in the darkness. "Landlord, for God's sake! Peter Coffin!" shouted I. "Landlord! Watch! Coffin! Angels, save me!" "Speakee! Tell me who ye be, or damme I kill ye!" again growled the cannibal, who his horrid flourishings of the tomahawk scattered the hot tobacco ashes about me till I thought my linen would get on fire. But thank heaven, at that moment the landlord came into the room, light in hand, and leaping from the bed I ran up to him. "Don't be afraid now," he said, grinning again. Queequeg here wouldn't harm a hair of your head." "Stop your grinning," shouted I. "And why didn't you tell me that the infernal harpooner was a cannibal?" "I thought you'd know it. Didn't I tell you he was peddling heads around town? But turn flukes again and go to sleep. Queequeg here Queequeg, look here. You sabe me, I sabe you. This man sleepy, you sabe? Me sabe plenty," uh, grunted Queequeg, puffing away at his pipe and sitting up in bed. "You getee in," he added, motioning to me with his tomahawk and throwing the clothes to one side. He really did this in not only a civil but really kind and charitable way. I stood looking at him for a moment. For all his tattooings, he was on the whole a clean, comely looking cannibal. What's all this fuss I have been making about? Thought I to myself. The man's a human being just as I am. He has just as much reason to fear me as I have to be afraid of him. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. "Landlord," said I, "tell him to stash his tomahawk there, or pipe, or whatever you call it. Tell him to stop smoking, in short, and I will turn in with him. But I don't fancy having a man smoking in bed with me. It's dangerous. Besides, I ain't insured." This being told to Queequeg, he at once complied, and again politely motioned me to get into bed, rolling over to one side as much as to say, "I won't touch a leg of ye." "Good night, landlord," said I. "You may go." I turned in, and never slept better in my life.